Chapter 3 is going to focus on victims and victimization. In the previous chapter, we did touch on victims and their role in crime. We were specifically talking about crime itself. This chapter is going to focus completely on the victims of crime. And some questions to keep in mind as we move forward, and my video lectures are broken down with regards to each question. What is the victim's role? What are the costs of victimization? What is the nature or what constitutes victimization? What are the theories of victimization, and how does society care for victims after they've been victimized? So keep these questions in mind as we move through the materials, and we are going to begin with the victim's role. There is a specific study of victims, victimology, and criminologists who study this only study victims. And those criminologists have a fancy name, those who study victims, the victimologists. So when we're talking about victimization, the study of victims, victimology, and those who study victimology are victimologists. They're still criminologists, but they specifically are focusing on victims. And for a long time, victims were merely viewed as the targets of criminal behavior. But over time, studies have found that victims actually play a significant role, whether it's directly or indirectly, in the crime through their own behavior. So it's actually more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So we are going to explore these theories of that role, those indirect and direct roles that they play as we move on through the video. But let's talk about the cost. This is a very costly, victims are very costly to society in three aspects. We're going to talk about the social costs or the economic costs. We're going to talk about the costs that they incur themselves as victims, and the legal costs. So let's talk about the societal costs. Hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Consider property crimes. We have theft, outright theft, or we have damage to property. There's specific losses relative to that. And we're not talking out of pocket for the victim yet. We're talking about the economy. So who would be out of pocket? Insurance companies, right? If the victim was insured, it doesn't come out of the pocket of the victim. Along with productivity losses. What do I mean by that? Well, if a victim can't work, right? There's trauma, there's injury, there's pain, they can't work, they're at home, so there's a loss of productivity of that individual in society. There was a study, Dr. Cohen did a study using direct costs, and what that direct cost is to determine what the total cost of the criminal act was. Now this does not, we're still talking about economic and societal costs, so this does not involve what's out of pocket of the victim. We're just talking about society. So direct costs, the productivity losses, the loss to insurance companies. And then they took the indirect cost to the individual, to the victim. And an indirect cost is not something that's out of pocket. Something that you might have seen or heard about in like a traffic accident when somebody's hurt. They call them personal injury cases. Pain and suffering, fear that comes as a result of being a victim. Those are indirect costs. And then took a chronic offender. We've discussed chronic offender. And determine what the estimate cost would be over the lifetime of that chronic offender. Total cost, and so this comes out to be the total cost of the criminal act itself over the lifetime of a chronic offender. And we know what a chronic offender is, somebody who repeats 5 plus more crimes or continuing along in their adult life as a criminal. And the estimated costs for that one chronic offender is between $1.7 and $2.3 million each chronic offender. So what does that tell you? Can we do something else with that money? Right, that's a large amount of money. What if we took a portion of that and put it into youth programming, right? Because chronic offenders start out as juvenile offenders, according to that cohort study we just talked about last chapter. If you put, a few $1,000s into that, you might save some of those youths. We won't have this kind of money spent. What about this? I'm only going to use murder, but if you're looking through the book on this topic, we're talking about just murder. And in the book, we have a list of serious crimes, the cost of each serious crime. Not all crimes, just the serious crimes. They have rape and they have assault. And this figure is the cost to society, the justice system, healthcare. So criminologists, Miss Catherine McCulster and her group of criminologists, victimologists, came up with a approach to determine the cost of each serious crime. And just murder, with one murder, cost to society on an average murder, just one, $9 million. And then if you take that number of how many average, about 16,000 Americans are victims of murder each year, when you take that number alone, you do the math, $190 billion in economic losses. That's a lot of money to society and to the economy. And that does not include the costs to the offender. Now, you might not think that's a big deal to the offender, but think about these. So think of the costs that are related to the offender in this case, not even a victim. The cost to imprison that person, especially if we're talking about murder, the cost to imprison that person, if they're sentenced to 25 to life. What about their family? They lose that person's income that can come in from family, the pain and suffering of the offender's family. So a lot of money, a lot of costs to society as a result of victimization. Does the victim have costs? Sure, the victim has costs involved. What are the costs? What are some of the direct costs suffered by a victim? Well, if they're not insured, or even if they were insured, they might have something that, a deductible, fancy term for they actually have to pay something first before then the insurance company will pay the balance. Or if they're not insured, they have to pay to replace the whole item stolen or damaged. They may have to pay their own medical costs. If they're not working, they lose their income, lost wages. Depending on if we're talking about a serious crime, like assault or rape, there's pain and suffering, reduced quality of life. Even if somebody burglarizes a home and they weren't there, there's always a fear involved of, will they come back? There might be counseling involved if you're a victim of a crime. So yeah, the individual has costs out of their pocket, not only out of their pocket, but as a part of their emotional state. And I'm going to take a little side note real quick before I go through the rest of my slide. Under the law, offenders are required to reimburse victims. It's very limited. It's usually for out-of-pocket only costs. They call that restitution, where if they damage the property, they'd be required to pay for it to be fixed. If there was stolen property, they have to pay for its replacement. If they suffered medical costs or counseling costs, they'd pay for those. Things like lost wages and pain and suffering, and any sort of fear that's instilled in them that's not something that's required, mandated that they pay. That may come in someplace else. We'll talk about how we care for victims at the end, and we'll talk about some reimbursements relative to those things. But I wanted to establish that the offender also has a role in allowing the victim to recoup some out of cost to them. But if they're going to prison, that may not happen. But I also want to switch gears talking about the serious violent crimes, right? More than half of victims of serious violent crimes, and let's lay them out: attempted murder, rape, sexual assault, robbery, kidnapping, arson. Those are all considered serious violent crimes. And victims to those crimes suffer post-traumatic stress, anxiety, fatigue, ultimately relationship problems, disruptions in their work if they're young, disruptions in school, long-term symptoms of depression, anxiety, self-destructive behavior. And it usually comes along with having no support available, support from family and friends, nothing provided. And this is essentially true for victims of sexual assault and rape, and children who suffer at the hands of their parents or other adults, or they've witnessed abuse. They have and they do suffer long-term psychological disorders, and it follows them into adulthood. And things, let's say, snowball from there. It can cause them, the childhood stress causes them and continues to cause them into adulthood to have relationship problems, relationship stress. They may become involved in an abusive relationship, either physically or psychologically. Victim fear is another cost to an individual. People who live in an area with high crime, they develop an overwhelming sense of fear, even if they're not a victim, regardless of them being a victim. If you live in a high crime area, you have an overwhelming sense of fear. And those who have been a victim, they dread being a victim again. And if living in one of the high crime areas, these people start to change their behavior. If they've been a victim, maybe they take measures and move out of the area, or maybe they take measures to protect themselves so it doesn't happen again, right? They get pepper spray or they buy a gun. Females are more fearful than men becoming a victim of a crime. As we know and discussed, fear is created by the media. They show crime stories that run continuously. They, mass shootings. The saying in journalism is, if it bleeds, it leads. And even those people who weren't a victim of a crime, they change their behavior as a result of this type of exposure to crime news. They think crime's happening around every corner. And fear, we're going to come back to fear. Fear of being a victim, or fear created as a result of being a victim, has made this group of people, the fearful people, more likely to engage in violence themselves. So we're going to talk, they come up again, our fearful victims come up again. But I want to switch to victim blame. That's another cost that they suffer as a victim suffers as a result of being victimized. Some victims, and the book uses rape as an example, the victim blames themselves. And again, especially when they don't have support from their families or friends, or law enforcement's questioning them about the incident, making suggestions that it was, their fault, or it was their own behavior that put them in that position. But it's not only rape, it occurs with other crimes too. Think of a theft crime. Car gets stolen, but you're the one who left the keys in the car, left the car unlocked, you left your house unlocked, and somebody comes in, breaks in, and steals stuff, or hurts a family member. Right? The victim starts to say, "What could I have done to prevent this?" Or this happened because I did blah blah blah. Domestic violence cases, a spouse abuses another spouse. The excuse is, well, if I didn't make him or her mad, he or she wouldn't have hit me. There's victim blame. That's a cost of being victimized. So we have the cost to society, we have the cost to the actual victim. And before I get to legal cost, consider this question. It's going to be part of the forum discussion, one of the three that'll be available for forum discussion. Should victims of assault receive financial compensation for their pain suffered, including bills, psychological counseling, reimbursement for wages? What other costs would you expect if you were assaulted or unable to work for several months? And the question is, who should pay for it? So think about those. Legal costs. Research shows that people who are victims of crime are more likely to commit crimes themselves. Why is that? Why do you think that is? It's this concept called the cycle of violence. Think about children who are abused at an early age. They then engage in delinquent behavior, and they continue committing those crimes, because it's no longer a delinquent act because they are now an adult. As an adult, they start to commit crimes, and then they become a chronic offender. And discussions and research that involved speaking with incarcerated offenders, those incarcerated offenders reported that they suffer from PTSD as a result of being victimized. So the suggestion is that may explain some of their violent and criminal behavior. Those individuals we discussed, fearing being a victim or fearing being re-victimized, they take drastic measures to protect themselves. So that poses risk of committing a crime. Think about if they were robbed and now they decided to get a gun to protect themselves. And an incident occurs where either they're about to be robbed again or they reasonably believe that they're going to be robbed again because they are in a state of fear and they pull out a gun and shoot somebody. The question is, who's the victim? Who's the victim? But they tend, to pose more risk of committing a crime now as a result. There are factors linking crime and victimization. Victimization causes social problems, unemployment problems. We talked about relationship problems. Young kids, young victims, to escape their offenders, their abusers, they run away. And then they increase their odds of being a victim or re-victimized or committing crimes. What else does victimization do? Prompts revenge. The victim may seek out their attacker. We see this with domestic violence cases. At one point, the spouse who's been abused for years just snaps and shoots the other spouse, the abuser. Or the other side of that, victims went on the attack to individuals who resemble their attacker or based on the general characteristics of the offender. There is a common cause that exists with crime and victimization. There's common cause, things like substance abuse. Right, we talked about a link. Substance abuse is linked to crime. It's also linked to victimization. If one experiences violence, can lead to crime. It also can lead to victimization. Psychological deficits same thing. Can lead to crime, can lead to victimization. So we do have some links and common causes between crime and victimization. Our next spot we are going to move into, the next area, not spot, the next question we're going to discuss. We just covered the costs. We discussed the role of the victims, and we discussed the costs to society, the victim themselves, and the legal costs that are involved. Now we're going to talk about what is the nature of victimization. That'll be in the next video. We'll pick up the question from there and consider that class discussion question a couple slides back. There'll be a couple more of those questions as we move forward, and then you'll get to choose one to discuss as part of a forum.